black broth, stone silence, a boy flogged at the altar, and a man who answered every question in a single dry word. That is the Sparta we think we know, the grim war camp of legend, admired and mocked in the same breath for more than 2,000 years. But the caricature hides a real city, a city with 2 kings and a council of elders, with overseers and common mess halls, a training program like nothing else in Greece, and a vast underclass that fed it. Its institutions produced the citizens every other Greek admired most. To see that city clearly, we have to start with a strange fact. The Spartans wrote almost nothing about themselves. Nearly everything we know was written by outsiders looking in. Since antiquity, Sparta was the city Greeks admired. They called it eunomia, a place of good order governed by sound law. The same writers despaired of Athens, whose radical democracy looked to them like the rule of the mob, destroying the rule of the best. Our modern instinct runs the other way. We celebrate Athens and recoil from Sparta, but that celebration is recent and the ancients did not share it, for 2 reasons. Athens lost the Peloponnesian War, and Athens put Socrates on trial and executed him, earning the undying hatred of his pupil Plato. The philosopher who shaped how the West would read Greece had no love for the city that killed his teacher. Sparta, by contrast, got the kinder verdict. Here lies the problem. Sparta received the warmer treatment, yet the Spartans themselves wrote nothing about their own constitution. Everyone who did right came from outside, and they wrote to moralize. They fall into 2 camps. The first admired the Spartan system as a model for fixing their own cities, and imagined Sparta as changeless, its laws handed down whole by a legendary founder like Lycurgus, who may have lived in the 8th century BC. The second camp praised the Sparta of old while lamenting the Sparta of their own day, ruined, they said, by money and moral decay. Both idealized the Sparta that never quite existed. Together, these outsiders built what scholars call the Spartan Mirage, a vivid, flattering, and deeply unreliable picture. A second difficulty is what Sparta left in the ground, which is very little. It stayed architecturally plain, and that plainness has fooled people ever since. Thucydides saw the trap coming. Imagine Sparta deserted, he wrote, with only its temple floors and foundations left. No future visitor would believe this shabby place had ruled Greece. The Spartans held 2/5 of the Peloponnese and led the whole peninsula and more. Yet their capital was no grand city on a grid. It was a loose cluster of 5 villages with no monuments to speak of. Now run the same test on Athens, Thucydides added, and its ruins would make it look twice as mighty as it ever was. Stone can lie. Sparta always looked weaker than it truly was. So whom do we trust? Our best witnesses stand well before or well after the war, and they line up across the centuries. Herodotus, writing in the mid-5th century BC, is the least prejudiced. He treats Sparta almost as an anthropologist treats a foreign land, the way he treats Persia or Egypt, and he found the Spartans genuinely strange, above all for keeping 2 kings from 2 royal houses long after other Greeks had scrapped their monarchies. Then come the annalists. Aristotle dissects the constitution in the 4th century BC. Polybius adds detail in the 2nd. Plutarch, centuries later, gives us lives of Lycurgus, of Lysander, of King Agesilaus, and a treasury of Spartan sayings. And Xenophon, an Athenian admirer, mourns how far the Spartans had fallen. Scholars love to pour all of this into a single mold and call it Sparta. That is a mistake. Sparta changed over time like every Greek city. The evidence comes from scattered places and scattered centuries. And here is the twist the moralizers missed. The Spartans fed the mirage on purpose. They were far shrewder than their reputation. They cultivated a pose, plain, blunt country folk from the hills of Laconia, men of few words and fewer tricks. It was a mask and a weapon. An opponent who expected simple soldiers was caught off guard by some of the canniest diplomats in Greece. The stern, dim Spartan was a costume, and the Spartans themselves were happy to wear it. Set the mirage aside and meet the real place. The Spartans lived in Laconia in the far southeast of the Peloponnese, and their city sat inland. 5 villages strung along the Eurotas River as it runs down from the mountains to the sea. They spoke Dorian. Greek split into 3 great families of dialect. Ionian, the East Greek of Athens and the islands, Dorian, spoken across the Peloponnese and the Crete, and Aeolian, in the center of the mainland. Those divisions were old. They reached back to the collapse of the first Greek civilizations. The world remembered in the heroic legends of roughly 1600 to 1200 BC, when Dorian-speaking peoples pushed down into the Peloponnese and redrew the map of who spoke what. The Spartans traced themselves to those Dorians, who came into the Eurotas Valley around the 11th century BC. Through the long, dim centuries we call the Greek Dark Age, they mastered the older peoples already living there. By about 800 BC, they had become a polis, a city-state. They never raised great walls or monuments, Thucydides again, but they built the machinery of a city all the same. In their own memory, they were 5 separate villages that had chosen to join into one. And unlike almost everyone else, they kept not one royal house, but 2. That double kingship, born in these early centuries, would shape Spartan politics for centuries to come. Start at the top, with the kings. There were always 2 drawn from 2 separate and rival houses, the senior line, the Agids, and the junior line, the Eurypontids. They were not autocrats. A Spartan king was a hereditary general and high priest who led far more by influence than by command. He had no bureaucracy, no corps of officials to enforce his will, so his power rested on character and reputation. And because there were 2 of them, each watched and checked the other, forever competing to outshine his rival. Where other peoples feared the overreach of a single monarch, Sparta simply ran 2 kings in harness, a built-in brake wired into the throne itself. Below the kings, the shape was familiar to any Greek. Call it an oligarchy, ruled by the landowning class, layered in tiers. At its core sat the Gerousia, a council of elders, 28 men chosen by acclamation, who met together with the 2 kings, 30 in all. Like councils everywhere in Greece, it was the standing body that could act for the community and call the citizens together when something big was at stake. Above even the Gerousia, in principle, stood the assembly of citizens, the sovereign body that actually passed the laws. Kings proposed and led. Elders deliberated. But the assembly in the end decided. On paper, it was the people who held the final word. But who exactly were the people? That is the question that decides everything in Sparta as in any Greek state. Not whether there was an assembly, but who was allowed to stand in it. In Sparta, the door was narrow. To vote, you had to be male, at least 30 years old, a full Spartan by birth on both sides, and a graduate of the common upbringing every citizen shared. Those men were few, perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 of military age, and by some counts as few as 3,000. That small, tight-knit brotherhood, raised together, thinking alike, was the entire sovereign people of Sparta. There was no separation of powers, no system of checks and balances, just the equals and their law. Then, as the system matured across the 8th and 7th centuries BC, Sparta added a 5th wheel, or rather 5 of them, the ephors, the overseers, a board of 5 citizens elected fresh every single year, likely from the leading families. Their brief was broad. They watched over the raising and the training of the young and over the moral and religious life of the whole community. Some modern scholars have tried to promote the ephors into something grander, a rotating cabinet of foreign ministers steering Sparta's diplomacy and drafting its treaties. The evidence for that is thin, resting on a few reports of ephors meeting foreign envoys, Better to keep them, as the sources show them, annual guardians of Spartan discipline and Spartan custom. So how did these pieces actually govern? Together and quietly. The kings, the council of elders, and the 5 ephors were known collectively as the authorities, in Greek teteleston lacedaemonian. They talked things through among themselves until they reached agreement, usually without a formal vote, then carried a single agreed position to the assembly, which weighed it and decided. The Spartans only bothered to vote when a real question hung in the balance, as it did in the crisis of 432 BC. This was a deferential, like-minded society that trusted its elders, and it made Sparta the mirror opposite of Athens, where the citizens loved nothing better than a long, loud argument and a show of hands, the same city-state form, two utterly different temperaments. Sparta was never just its 5 villages, it ruled a broad country. Laconia, its home ground in the southeast and beyond the mountains to the west, the rich land of Messenia. Messenia did not join willingly. Sparta took it by force in 2 long and brutal wars, the first traditionally dated 736 to 716 BC, the second 668 to 657 BC, generations apart. First, Laconia was secured, then Messenia was conquered and held. And with conquest came a question every conqueror faces. What do you do with the people you have beaten? Sparta's answer was to sort them, rank by rank, into a rigid ladder of status that defined the whole society. On the first rung stood the Perioikoi. The name means the dwellers around, and other Greek states had them too. These were free people, living in their own towns, running their own local affairs under their own laws. What they were not was Spartan citizens. They could not vote in the assembly, but they owed Sparta their bodies in war. Called up, drilled, and led into battle by Spartan officers, they eventually stood in the ranks shoulder to shoulder with Spartans themselves. How many were there? We do not really know, but they were almost certainly more numerous than the tidy old estimates allow. A large free population woven right into the Spartan war machine without ever holding a Spartan vote. On the bottom rung stood the helots, and here the popular story goes badly wrong. The helots are usually described as state slaves owned collectively by a sinister Spartan government running a kind of ancient police state. The sources say no such thing. Helots were private property owned by individual Spartans, not by the state at all. Many of them were the conquered people of Messenia. A man could be sunk into helotry for rebellion, but the ladder ran both ways. A loyal Perioikos might be raised to citizenship. A helot who fought bravely in war could be freed and probably joined the dwellers around. Status in Sparta was harsh, but it was not frozen. People could fall, and sometimes they could climb. And this is where the most famous image of Sparta collapses. We picture a tiny sliver of Spartans, 5% of the population, the story goes, perched atop a seething mass of the oppressed, a handful of masters, an ocean of slaves. The numbers do not support it. Count the free population, Spartans and Perioikoi together, and you get roughly half the whole. One plausible reckoning runs 10,000 Spartans, 15,000 Perioikoi, and 25,000 adult helots. Double every figure if you like. The balance holds. Free and unfree stood at something close to parity. And that, in the end, is the only way the arithmetic of control makes sense. A tiny elite cannot hold down an overwhelming majority. A society split roughly in half can. So the ladder was not cruelty for its own sake. It solved the problem. Most Greek cities, choked by growing populations, shipped their surplus people overseas to found colonies. Sparta did not need to. It simply absorbed the land and the people next door. And from 580 BC, it began pulling more distant states into alliance as well. The best comparison is not some grim slave empire, but early Rome, with its full citizens, its neighbors of half-citizen status, and its outer ring of allies. Picture Sparta the same way, Spartans at the core, Perioikoi around them, and the wider Peloponnesian League beyond, with the Spartans always supplying the command. Sparta was building, quite deliberately, a coalition. Once you see Sparta as a coalition, its whole history snaps into focus. Why did the Greeks hand Sparta command of the alliance against the Persian invasion? Because Sparta already knew how to lead allied armies. Why could it put such huge forces in the field? The coalition. How did it later carry that same command structure onto the decks of a war fleet? The same habit of coalition command. And why were Spartan officers still in demand as late as the 3rd century BC, hired out to whip other armies into shape, even that of Carthage in the campaigns of 256 and 255 BC, because that was Sparta's true genius, not a landlord squeezing serfs, a school for commanders. Now the famous Spartan institutions fall into place. The agoge, the long communal upbringing, and the syssitia, the common mess halls where grown Spartans ate, worshipped, and lived their social lives together. We tend to imagine these as machinery for breeding fanatics. Seen against the coalition, they look like something else entirely. The training and bonding of an officer class, drilling men to a pitch of physical and military excellence so they could lead allies and subjects in the field. In those messes and on those training grounds, the values of the city were poured into the young, and the ancient laws, credited to the great founder Lycurgus, were studied, honored, and obeyed. Sparta was above all forging leaders. A word about that founder's people and their famous silence. The Spartans were literate. They read and they wrote. They were also laconic. The very word comes from Laconia, meaning sparing, dry, economical with speech. But brevity is not stupidity. It is a long way from a plain terse manner to the cartoon of the Spartan as a thick-headed bumpkin. In truth, Sparta was a living survival of an older Greece, the archaic world of the 7th and 6th centuries BC, and the Spartans clung to its traditional values long after others let them go. They poured themselves into religious festivals. They prized choral poetry. Their fewness of words hid a rich and conservative inner life. And behind the plain front, there was wealth. The Spartans accumulated gold and fine plate, even as they refused to mint gold or silver coins. Their houses were modest but well kept, with no showing off. A studied outward equality meant to bind every citizen into the same disciplined brotherhood. Yet measure a Spartan by what he actually needed to take part in Spartan life, and he was an aristocrat by any other city's standard. He commanded broad farmland and its surplus. Many of them kept horses. They competed at the Olympic Games, though Sparta once pulled out of the combat events. The image of the Spartan hillbilly comes from Athenian comedy and later moralizing, and it hides an aristocracy of the first rank. So what was this upbringing actually like? Demanding and early. Spartan children, boys and girls alike, were taken into it from the age of 6, then sorted into a strict ladder of age grades, each with its own trials, about which the ancient anecdotes never stop. When a man finally graduated, he was enrolled in a mess hall, to which he had to contribute his share of food, and that mess is the key. It was really an expanded version of something every Greek city knew, a club, where men who had trained hard together passed on shared values and each held a stake in the whole. Think less of a totalitarian indoctrination camp and more of the tight, proud world of an officer's mess. And what did that upbringing produce? Men of a very particular stamp. They took their religious duties seriously and kept their oaths as sacred. Above almost everything, they revered old age, tradition, and the law. Anecdote after anecdote turns on a Spartan's reverence for that law and his readiness to give up everything for the city. That devotion had two great payoffs. It goes a long way toward explaining Spartan success on the battlefield, and it explains something quieter but just as remarkable, Sparta's stability. Alone among the great Greek states, Sparta was spared the civil wars and the strongmen, the tyrants who seized power elsewhere, discipline at home, and the victory abroad. No one caught this Spartan spirit better than Herodotus, writing of the great Persian wars fought between 490 and 479 BC. He tells a story. A Spartan king named Demaratus had been driven out of Sparta and had taken shelter at the court of Xerxes, the great king of Persia. In 480 BC, Xerxes launched his colossal invasion of Greece. As the host gathered, his officers were boasting. Their army was so vast, so terrible, that it would simply roll over the Greeks. One of them sneered that he alone could handle 10 Greeks at once, with a contemptuous glance at the exiled king. And Xerxes, amused, turned to Demaratus and asked him what he made of it. Demaratus answered carefully. He would not claim to beat 10 men, he said, or even 2. In truth, he would rather not fight even 1. But if some great cause drove him on, nothing would please him more than to face one of these men who thought himself worth 3 Greeks. Man for man, he told Xerxes, Spartans are as good as any soldiers alive. Fighting together, they are the best in the world. For though they are free, they are not entirely free. They have a master, and that master is the law, ho nomos, which they fear far more than your subjects fear you. Whatever it commands, they do. And its command never changes, never flee, whatever the odds. Hold your place in the line, conquer or die. Xerxes laughed the speech away. What else would you expect from a bitter exile whose own people had thrown him out? But the laughter did not last. Not long after, at a narrow pass called Thermopylae, 300 Spartans under their king Leonidas, with their Peloponnesian allies beside them, threw back assault after Persian assault. The first hard check the invasion had met. And there, at last, Xerxes understood. It was exactly what Demaratus had said. The law, and not the whip, was what drove these men to stand and die. Had Sparta only found its own devoted historians, the way Rome later found the Polybius and the Livy to sing its wars, we would remember this stern city very differently indeed. Strip the Mirage away then, and read the anecdotes with fresh eyes because they cut 2 ways. Take the most famous one. An Athenian visitor served the notorious Spartan black broth, tastes it and quips that now he understands why Spartans do not fear death. With a dinner like this, who would want to live? It is a wonderful line. It is also almost certainly a performance. The Spartans loved to seem so hard they could thrive on the meanest scraps. In fact, they were superbly trained and physically fit, well fed enough to be among the finest infantry in Greece. The black broth was part of the costume. But turn to another story, and the Spartan virtue is suddenly disarmingly real. It happened at the Olympic Games in the region of Elis in the northwest, the greatest of all Greek festivals, held every 4 years, where merely to compete was to prove yourself a Hellene. The stands were packed, not a seat to be had. An old man of Elis shuffled along the rows looking for somewhere to sit, and one crowd after another looked away and pretended not to see him. Then he reached a block of young Spartans, Ephebes, with their trainer, and every one of them rose at once, each offering the old man his place. And Plutarch gives us the line that says everything. All the Greeks, he wrote, know what is right to do, but only the Spartans do it. That single line holds the whole society in miniature. A discipline so deep it needed no order given, a reverence for law and for age that outsiders mocked over the black broth, even as they envied it. Strip away the mirage, and what remains is not a nation of grim provincials chewing gruel. It is a city that sorted whole peoples by their worth in war and trained the officers to lead them. the quiet machinery behind the most admired citizens in Greece. This is the Sparta that marched to the Peloponnesian War, not the caricature, the real thing, and understanding it is the first step toward understanding how that terrible war was fought, and how, against every expectation, it was won.